Welcome back, everybody, to another great episode of The Human Role. So, this episode, we are going to focus on pay transparency, which is really, really big. Starting to pick up, especially now that some states are putting out new laws where employers are now required to put a reasonable pay range in job postings, right? As they're looking for roles. So let's start off on like potentially what is even pay transparency, right? So if you've ever come across or overheard or been chatting with a peer in your office and compensation has come up and you've discovered that, hey, you two are doing the same work and then maybe their pay is higher than yours and you're kind of curious about it. Or if you've been in a situation where you've been applying for a job and it doesn't even have the pay range. And so you're kind of like thinking maybe you've been with a company for many, many years. And based on your tenure with the company, you've gotten some heavier increases, right? So you think may potentially be heavier increases. And so you may not even want to apply because you're not even sure what the company's pay range is. So that kind of may be a deciding factor, and you may kind of get in your head and not even apply for the role. Multiple different factors when it comes down to, pay transparency and why we find ourselves here today, where more and more states are coming up with specific laws to put into place where employers are required to actually post a reasonable pay range. It can't say, hey, look, this role is between 80,000 to 250,000, right? It needs to be reasonable for you to kind of have a general understanding of what the company is willing to pay prior to posting. I believe this is anything that a federal law has put into place, but definitely state laws are starting to put things into place, which I think is a really good thing for employees. So we have, reasonable idea and can understand, hey, look, if our range is closer to 200K and this role is only offering 100K range-ish or so, 80 to 100, and that's not something that we can do. I think that's good for us to know instead of applying for a role, talking to a recruiter, waiting till you get to the hiring manager, only to discover down the line that your compensations don't align, right? So kind of just nipping it in the bud pretty early on there. So let's get into the details of pay, transparency and kind of like what that specifically means for you. It's more so an employer practice, right, to disclose information about employee compensation standards to others. So whether that's internally or externally or both. And then, it's not really technically defined at like one specific level. It's really across a whole scope of things, right? It could also boil down to your tenure, which is why a range is definitely needed. Because if you're lower in the years of your tenure compared to someone who has 10 plus years of experience, their compensation, could essentially be a little bit different than yours, right? And then also it's mentioned it's heavily based on state mandate or local mandates structuring. So it differs from state to state. And then also some states are required to publish these ranges for other positions. So from that stance, if you're an employer and you're across multiple states, so if you're a multi-state employer and you're posting a role and you're open to that role being remote, depending on certain states, you may need to post the pay range for those different states. So I have seen lots of postings, and some of you all may or may not have seen certain postings where it will actually show, hey, look, if you're in these specific states, the range will be between this. If you're in these specific states, your range will be through this, right? So that also is just, based on the cost of living in every single state, since that is, varying heavily across the board. So really important to pay attention to if you are an employer and you're posting in states that don't require the pay range. Suggestion is to kind of like get on board and get those pay ranges posted in general, because I think, I've said this several times, I will still repeatedly say this, is that we are now heavily into an employee market. And, employees want to just know what you're offering. And that also kind of just saves time ahead of time, right? It saves times for everyone, for your internal recruitment team, for hiring managers, and even for the candidate who is applying for the job, right? Just giving everyone a generalized idea. So I know when this was first coming out, some odd years ago, it was really internally being from an HR, on the HR and payroll side. Lots of employers were pretty worried about this coming about. Because if you do payroll, you actually see everyone's pay, obviously. And so unlike a regular employee who doesn't technically see pay, you see the imbalances, right? When people are hired in, whether that comes down to experience, whether that comes down to race, whether that comes down to gender. And so, for those of you all out there who may or may not know, the EEOC does require employers to report in information when it comes to their employee population. That does include race and gender roles and titles and so forth. And at some point, there was a requirement to get pay included as well, but that requirement has been halted at the moment. But at least a lot of the states have moved forward and are starting to require for conversation to be put through, which I think is, definitely a good thing. So from pay transparency stance, different from pay equity as well. So don't want to get those two confused, but we're just solely focused on pay transparency. This is the part where employers are required to put out there what the compensation is for each specific role. So let's even talk about why this is even a topic, right? Because for many, many years, there was a lot of secrecy, I guess you can say, around pay and employers, not really wanting employees to talk about it. I think, sometimes now, just depending on open positions, that conversation may or may not come up. But previously, prior to this coming into play, I mean, there was a really, really hush hush, right? You never talked about what you made. And that was just like an unspoken territory within the corporate America business. And so a lot has transpired since then. That secrecy has been lifted. And the more and more it's been seen through stats that, women have been paid less than men in the same roles. That has really heavily become a topic of discussion. And so there definitely is a lot of history that goes on behind the scenes as to why we've gotten here to this point. For me, being in the industry for over 15 years, I'm a bit shocked that we have gotten to this point, but also really happy just because even from my own experience with applying for roles or even giving my expected salary out, right, to employers without even knowing what their expectation is a little bit hard, a little bit difficult. Sometimes it's like, okay, we've gotten to 2 to 3 interviews and then you're just hearing about what the salary is. That can be hard to kind of like swallow when you're going through the process and it's like you wasted so much time, especially if you're already working a full-time job. Sometimes it gets difficult to like step away from the job to interview. And if you're traveling to interview on site, that's a whole nother thing. And yeah, you might have a phone screening, but typically you would go into interview. So that always put kind of like a little bit of a damper on the recruiting experience. So I think just having that out in the open when you are applying for a role definitely speaks volumes, not only to yourself, to where you can apply for a role and it's within your pay range, but also the recruiting team and HR team who are sorting through resumes. If someone is applying for this role, they've already been transparent on what their range is. And so just knowing that you're not wasting your time going through sourcing candidates, doing phone screenings for someone who was going to drop out later because, of a range is good. And I would say too, if you are an employee that is applying for jobs and you're hoping for the higher range, really look at your experience and make sure your experience checks off every single box within that range so that you can push for that higher range. And because most employers are probably looking for like a medium, in the middle, or potentially may even be looking for lower ranges. Sometimes I have even put in to be on the higher range and my experience speaks for that. But since the pay ranges are transparent now, the recruitment team is able to come back early on and just say, hey, look, the employer is actually looking to hire at the lower end range. So even though, I've met all qualifications and yes, I am deserving of the higher range, they technically want to stay on the lower range. And so we're able to have that conversation early on before we waste anybody's time down the line, which is also really helpful. So lots of different buckets on the history, but also like in full example of why keeping this up is really good, longer term, even for states who don't require the pay range to be listed. I think it's good to kind of just get that out the way so that when someone is applying, they know. And if you're not going to accept the candidate because they are requesting a higher range, you can let them know early on, nip it, and, move on and go on to your other candidates. And look, this is more than just pay transparency. This also ties back into the company culture and trust, right? We've had a bunch of episodes on culture and really talked about how, your population needs to be able to trust you, right? You want to make sure that you're not doing the same job as someone and there's a $20 to $30,000 gap unless, that's a reasonable gap for whatever reason, right? Maybe someone's been with the company for 50 years, which does so happen, even though in our millennial generation, sometimes we're like leaving jobs every few years, but there are still generations that have been in their role for many, many years. So that may explain that specific gap. But outside of that, I think just having that open transparency and for whomever is sitting in that role to be confident enough to know that whoever you are hiring next to them in their seat, if you're backfilling, if the work is picking up and you need an extra person in a role to kind of just help alleviate some of the workload amongst your team, I think it just gives the rest of your team confidence that whoever you're going to be bringing in isn't going to be making substantially more to them, that it's going to be a very fair pay environment so that everyone could come in and work closely together and that they don't feel like someone is going to come in over them. So that keeps that open communication and trust going with your team, with your company, keeps a culture pretty heavy that they don't feel like, an employer is running around keeping secrets. I know that from an employee stance, there are people who still feel that way. And I think just the more and more you are openly communicating about not only, pay, but just anything else, any transitions or changes that are going on with your company goes a long way, right? And so this is just another factor of that. We've talked about that when we have discussed AI and how, companies are bringing AI into their company and how they're using it, right? And being transparent with that, even from a benefit stance, right? All of this plays back into your company culture, which in turn helps saves and adds to your tenure, right? And make sure employees want to come to work. And that's really from the human aspect, the human role aspect. We really want to just make sure our employee population is feeling safe and secure and feeling that they can trust us as employers and as, your HR team and payroll team. So that also adds into this transparency factor, right? It ties back into the culture of things. And you always want to keep that up, right? You don't want people to feel a type of way or be nervous when they're coming into work. I'm hoping that as time goes on, we'll have more states put things into place, or we'll have more employers who are open to being more transparent when it comes to their compensation. That way, it's an open book, everybody feels comfortable, and that alleviates one issue that we would have to potentially deal with down the line. And from an employer stance, so if you are multi-state, as mentioned before, I just kind of briefly went through what I've seen other employers do when they're posting across multiple states, potentially hiring across multiple states for one specific role. So from a compliance stance, prior to you posting a role that could be hybrid, you want to make sure you are looking up those state laws and abiding by those state laws and making sure that if those states do require for you to put out there what the salary range is, that you do have a valid salary range. So there's definitely lots of systems that can help you with scaling potential salaries for the specific role that you're going for. And you want to make sure you stay up with that, right? You don't want to post for a C-suite role that is typically, well into six figures, over 200-ish or so, and put a post out there that, hey, look, the range is 125 to, 175, right? If you're looking at a chief executive officer role, CFO role, CHR role, and depending on where your company is at that stance, sometimes those ranges may not be acceptable. But if you're in a rural area and, your company just isn't able to afford a higher salary, you may want to think about changing the title of the role if it doesn't match that, or be very transparent in your posting, right, with where you are with your current company. Maybe you're in a beginning startup phase. And so the salary ranges, may not be as top heavy as a company that's already global. So all of those you want to factor in. Of course, you can always get legal involved. It's always a safe bet just to make sure you're covering all grounds. But I do want to say that from an employer stance, when you are covering multiple states. So if you are on a fully remote model, even a hybrid model, and you have maybe different locations that someone could go into, those locations could be in Georgia, New York, California, DC, Florida. They could be all over the place based on where your locations are, maybe even in Texas. you want to make sure that you have those salary ranges there, at least for the states, a minimum for the states that require those salary ranges. And then for the states that don't require those salary ranges, maybe if you're comfortable, you put in what your standard salary would be for those specific states, or you could always say, there will be a different salary range that applies for states outside of the above or below or something like that. So definitely make sure from an employer stance that you have all of your T's crossed and I's dotted, just to make sure that you are properly listing the pay ranges for the states, especially when you get into a multi-state situation where you could potentially have remote workers. You also want to drill down to the localities to see if the locals have any specific laws. And I would just say, be reasonable. Once you have the range out there and you start talking to candidates, you'll be able, with our experience at this level, you'll be able to easily identify what level this person, is at. And then I think having a conversation early on, this is our pay range, but also asking what someone's expected salary would be as well, right? Just to make sure if they are going to be on the higher range, that is okay with the hiring manager and with those specific budgets. Just because I know sometimes, just for any candidate out there who may not know, sometimes a higher range, may include like a bonus structure too, right? So that might not be a part of the base salary initially, like your base biweekly salary, but it could be a part of your annual salary based on bonuses. It could be about stocks if your company is public. So that could be another thing that you could factor in too. So that could also go into payment as well. They could also even be factoring in benefits. So that could be another thing that you want to consider too, is that outside of your salary, the salary that you're getting, how good are their company benefits, right? And so all of those could play a factor into the salary range. So it's really, really important to ask those specific questions, whether it's in your initial screening or definitely your first official interview with the hiring manager, so that all of those boxes are checked off and everything is, covered and we don't have any issues in case there needs to be like a second or third interview. Okay, let's get into, we've talked about like the legal stuff, just making sure that from an employer stance, you're checking all boxes before you're posting. Also, we've covered from an employee stance, kind of like, hey, look, what to look out for when you're applying for jobs and when you are applying and in the interview process, how to kind of have those conversations early on. But also wanted to circle back to an employer stance as well, because there could be a situation where some employees start talking and you do have employees working the same specific roles, but one is getting paid more than the other. You always want to just make sure that as you're evaluating every year, definitely let's try to do audits annually. Obviously, that's easier said than done. We know we have to report to the EEOC because that's a requirement, but I think it's important to just make sure that internally we're not getting off track with our salary ranges. And if you don't have a salary range in place, definitely start to get that in place prior to this coming out, when this was being made aware that, hey, look, there were some dates, effective dates as certain states were rolling this out. There were a lot of companies that knew that they needed to go in and audit and knew that they needed to get salary ranges in place because those were not in place, right? A lot of times most of the time they weren't in place. A lot of times those were just kind of like, okay, people were being hired based on experience. Sometimes, of course, we know based on who you know, and I'm also sometimes tenure within the company. And so a lot of things were kind of like uneven internally when it came to specific pay gaps. It's hard to say whether things were intentional or unintentional, but they were there nonetheless. And so I think from this stance, just making sure you have your salary ranges in place. There are plenty of companies that can help you with salary ranges for specific roles. Quick Google search will pop up a lot. You can even start with your HCM provider. Lots of them have generalized information from even the companies that use their system to at least be able to give you some type of foundation based on certain states. And then there's others that will help you with the pay ranges, globally as well. So I think from that stance, you want to just make sure you internally have your salary ranges in place, and you can go through some legal compliance for that as well, just to make sure that's all set in stone. It's never going to be perfect because there's obviously always going to be somebody who wants to go above that specific pay range. Maybe something's going on internally. There's some turnover. Maybe one specific person is taking on more work. So there may be some one-offs throughout the year. But I think that if that starts getting out to your population, and employees start to come back and start to question why that's happening, it's really good maybe just to have like some examples. This is a part of being trustworthy and transparent, right? I know that sometimes in some of these meetings, HR can get a little stern and can really get upset. And then we end up turning into retaliation because one employee spoke up about, their pay. One employee is disgruntled about that, right? We really want to stay away from that because that leads to nothing good. So you definitely want to just make it clear as to certain reasons, right? Someone could be with the company longer. If there's a misstep internally with the company, then let them know that, hey, look, you'll look into it and you'll circle back to them and then get back with legal to kind of see how you want to handle that situation. Sometimes you will even have the supervisor or the manager at a different location, or maybe they may overpromise something that just is not in the budgets and cannot be done. And then you have a disgruntled employee coming to you. So you want to just make sure you have specific reasons as to why someone's pay range may be a little bit higher than someone else's. If it's an internal tenure thing, that's one thing. But we've definitely seen it. I've seen it so many times in my career where someone has been with the company for 5 years, but then a new person comes in and is making more money than that person, right? And sometimes it's like, hey, look, this person may or may not potentially check another box that the person who's been with the company a long time hasn't. And then maybe look into, hey, look, do you want to, if the person who's making less is upset, do you want to offer like some training for that person, right? And see if you can fit that into some training budgets, potentially let them cross train one another, right? So that at some point in the next performance review, that can be added to an evaluation and we can get them more even. So there's a couple of different, ways that you can go about thinking about doing things like that. So I just say, keep an open mind. And when those tough conversations happen, just make sure you have a game plan. And if you are not at a point to where you're comfortable enough responding at that current moment, take a step back, let the employee speak, take notes, document that, and just let them know that you will circle back to them. Maybe set up a meeting within, 48-hour time frame, 72-hour time frame, even the following week, just depending on how many other people you need to talk to, and then circle back to them and just have that conversation at a later date. Just because sometimes I've seen one too many times where HR meetings have gotten just overly heated. And it's just kind of like, okay, let's not, from our stance, from that HR stance, let's not feed into that immediately. So just some suggestions on how to handle some of those tough conversations that could potentially come up, especially when you're talking about people's pay. All right. So just wanting to recap kind of like the best practices, I guess you can say, when it comes to pay transparency, right? So definitely want to really recognize that it is very appropriate. So this is absolutely the new normal. It is not anything that is just kind of like a fad that's kind of just like going to go in and out. This is definitely something that is going to be here to stay, right? And so the latter part of this podcast episode is just to talk about like the conversations that could potentially happen. So you want to just make sure that you are prepared to answer those questions and, allow your team to ask questions and build that trust and confidence and letting them know that they can absolutely ask you, anything that they want. Knowing your organization's policies is really, really critical just to make sure that you're not saying something wrong and then having to go back to course correct yourself, especially if an employee is really kind of being in your face. And then just kind of keeping up with audits, right? So we want to continue to audit ourselves and just make sure that we are staying on top of things, and then knowing the laws, right? We want to make sure we know the laws when it comes to the states that we're in and just keeping that up, right? And the laws are ever changing from federal, especially to every single different state, right? So we want to just make sure we keep up to speed on that information. So I know this was a quick episode, but just wanted to bring this to you all today, just to kind of just make sure that we are continuing to be transparent about pay and just continuing to help build that specific trust with our employees, just because it is definitely important and it is going to become more important, especially as we get into a lot of the inflation that's going on right now. So do whatever you can to keep your employees happy, keep that retention up, try to avoid turnover as much as possible. And if it is something to where, hey, look, if you can adjust 25 cents, 50 cents, something minor like that, maybe not, pick your battles, right? Maybe not battle that too much because that could go a very long way. So all right, you guys. So thank you so much for listening. If you made it this far, I will be coming soon in a couple of weeks with another great episode. But thank you all so much for watching. I will see you all soon.